So the next part that we're going to get into is the structure of carbohydrates. Now you're going to see a lot of chains and things like that, but don't worry, you're not going to need to memorize these at all. So let's first talk about the monomers and polymers. So in a carbohydrate, the monomers, or those simplest units, are called monosaccharides. So they share the name mono, meaning one, and for carbohydrates, saccharides, that means sugars. Carbohydrates are our sugars. You'll also hear the term referred to as simple sugars, and if you've already completed the lab exercises, you may have seen that term in there. So you already know about one pretty important monosaccharide, that's glucose. And glucose is the one pictured here in the middle. There's also fructose, galactose, ribose, and deoxyribose. Now there's more than these, but these are the major ones. You should be able to recognize these. I won't ask you, say in a short answer question, to list these. But you should be aware of them, especially glucose. That's the most important one. You're not going to need to know these structures at all, but know that these are the monosaccharides. Now, we only talked about monomers and polymers. So monomers being one unit and polymers being many. Well, in carbohydrates, they do have a special term for two monosaccharides. So say a glucose plus a glucose, or a glucose plus a fructose, etc. Those are called disaccharides. So that prefix di means two. So this is saying two sugars. Now you're not going to need to remember these equations, so you're not going to need to remember glucose plus fructose equals sucrose, but you should know sucrose and lactose are the two disaccharides we're going to be talking about. Sucrose is the sugar you buy in the store. That's table sugar. Lactose, you've probably heard of, is in cow milk. So it's a sugar that some people who are lactose intolerant can't actually break down. But know when we refer to carbohydrates that this is a disaccharide, meaning it's two sugars. But it's still synthesis. We still have monomers coming together, releasing a water molecule, and forming a bond. Now finally, you can probably guess what multiple monosaccharides is. It's a polysaccharide, just like the word polymer. So if you have many monosaccharides together and they're bonded to each other, you're going to create a polysaccharide, meaning many sugars. Now we've actually already talked about all of these polysaccharides that you need to know. So we've talked about glycogen, we've talked about cellulose, we've also talked about starch. And remember, we were talking about those when we were talking about energy storage. All of those were created with glucose, and glucose is the most commonly used monosaccharide of all of the monosaccharides. You don't really see really large chains such as this one in glycogen or in cellulose with anything else. Glucose is a really good shape to make these very large molecules with. Now, even though they're all made of glucose, they're in different shapes. And you're like, okay, so what? But those different shapes have pretty important functions. They have different functions. Remember that cellulose was the carbohydrate responsible for giving that structure in cell walls. So if you look at cellulose, we have this nice sheet, very uniform. You can probably stack those really easily and pack them in really tight to make a really turgid cell wall. Whereas glycogen, which is what animals make, you can't really pack that in together. It doesn't really form into each other. You can't make nice walls out of that or really anything. Glycogen is just used for energy storage. It's not used for any kind of structure in humans or other animals. So even though, again, the main point, they're made of the same thing, but they have different functions because of their different shape. Polysaccharides, so again, this is many monosaccharides, so glycogen, cellulose, starch. In our diet, when we eat them, we don't say, oh, I'm going to go eat a bunch of cellulose or I'm going to eat a bunch of starch. You don't really say that. In the nutrition world, it's referred to as dietary fiber or just fiber. You may have seen commercials for products with fiber in it, such as Benefiber, Activia, which is a yogurt, fiber pills, because they're really important in our diet. Now, what fiber actually is, I said it's a polysaccharide, but humans cannot break them down. Our bodies are just not adapted to break down this cellulose or break down this starch. Now, some animals, such as cows, can. They're eating grasses all the time, they're eating plants all the time, so it's pretty important for their body to be able to break down all of these polysaccharides that they are consuming on a daily basis. Now, just because humans can't break them down doesn't mean they don't serve a use. They're actually very useful. They don't get clogged up in our system or anything like that. It's not that we can't break them down and it's going to wreak havoc. Quite the opposite. It's actually a way to clean out our intestines. We have feet and feet of intestines, and as disgusting as it sounds, yes, things get caught in it and things just kind of sit there. But it's nice to have some sort of foods that kind of clean it out. Think about, if you've ever had a clogged sink or a clogged toilet, pipes get stuff in them. Get some Drano, kind of washes it all out. It's the same thing with our intestines. Stuff gets stuck in there, but dietary fiber can help clean us out. So again, main point, polysaccharides are considered dietary fiber, so good for us. The last thing that I want to touch on when talking about carbohydrates is how a disease can be focused on a carbohydrate. So I'm going to talk about diabetes mellitus. So just think of diabetes. Diabetes mellitus is the same thing as just diabetes, which is probably what you've heard it referred to. The official name is the diabetes mellitus. So every single healthy person, so those who don't have diabetes, really anyone, they need glucose. Everyone needs glucose. Every animal needs glucose. Every plant needs glucose because that's what's fueling cellular respiration. And here's that formula again for cellular respiration. Our cells need that glucose in order for us to get that ATP energy. Now, our cells don't really get it for themselves. So we'll eat something that's going to release sugar into our blood, and our cells need that glucose, and they're supposed to get it from the blood, but they're not going to take it unless someone tells them to. That cell could really use some glucose, but unless something tells it, oh, hey, it's okay to take that glucose out of the blood, it won't, even if it really needs it. Now, what it is that tells our cells that it's okay to take out glucose from the blood is insulin. And that's released by one of our organs called the pancreas, which you'll actually get to look at when we do the pig dissection lab. So insulin is going to be released into the blood and tell our cells, hey, you know what? It's okay to pick up some of this glucose from the blood. It's good. We have a lot of extra glucose in the blood. So you know what? Help us out. Take it out. You need that glucose anyway. It's great. So people with diabetes, whether it's type 1 or type 2 diabetes, and I'll talk about the difference between those here soon. Oh no, my Verizon's on. We'll talk about this soon. So no matter what, if it's type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes, and we'll talk about the difference between those soon, they can't get glucose. Now when they eat, their body's going to get glucose. That's going to raise the amount of glucose or sugar levels in their blood. But the cells are no longer taking in that glucose. Something's wrong with the insulin. It doesn't matter how much those cells need glucose. It doesn't matter how much is in the blood. Cells will not take it in unless insulin tells it to. So people with diabetes, there's something wrong along the way. At some point, those cells are not getting glucose. So as you can imagine, this can have some health effects. First of all, our cells, or those with diabetes, can't get glucose, meaning they can't undergo cellular respiration, so they can't create energy. So that's going to cause cells to die. Now, having a lot of blood sugar or blood glucose levels, a very high level, can cause health effects on its own. Organs do not like having a lot of sugar in our blood. Same way as some organs like the liver don't like having a lot of alcohol in the blood. So some of the negative health effects, if gone untreated, of diabetes is blindness, heart and kidney disease, nerve damage, gangrene. Gangrene is what leads to amputations. So very serious effects if gone untreated. So you may be familiar, or if you're not, there are two different forms of diabetes. There's type 1 diabetes. This is the one that people are typically born with. And in this case, the body isn't producing insulin. Somewhere along the line, when that fetus was developing, or some genetic disease or something, resulted in that person's body just not producing insulin at all. Their pancreas cannot produce insulin. Well, if there's no insulin, that means that those cells never going to get glucose. So people with type 1 diabetes are typically taking insulin shots. So they're actually injecting themselves with insulin. So that's going to tell their body, hey, you know what? Go ahead, take some glucose out of your blood. It's good. It's okay. Now, those with type 2 diabetes, this typically is a result of poor food choices, lack of exercise. But what happens is insulin is still being produced, but the cells aren't really responding to it well. It sees it there, but it doesn't take that as a direction. Insulin comes in, and the cells are like, oh, hey, insulin, but nothing happens. That's it. Now, scientists don't really know the cause of type 2 diabetes. Some cases it could be more genetic, other cases it's more diet-based. So here we have a cell, and we're going to say all of these stars are glucose. Now, cells need that glucose. That glucose is a source of energy for them. So in normal people without diabetes, you're going to have, we're just going to call this square type thing, insulin. It's going to come in, it's going to bind to this cell, and it's going to tell the cell, hey, you know what, it's totally fine. We've got a lot of glucose in the blood, go ahead and take some up. So insulin gives this cell the okay, so you're going to have glucose moving in to the cell. So this is a normal person, someone who's not sick. Alright, so let's say this person has type 1 diabetes. So I'm just going to do this in a different color. They still have a cell. They still have glucose on the outside of this cell, but we no longer have insulin. We no longer have a signal that's saying, hey, you know what, it's okay. It's okay to take in that glucose. So glucose never moves in. You just get more and more glucose outside the cell because none of the cells are taking in glucose. Finally, you could have, let's say, someone with type 2 diabetes. So type 2, they are still making this insulin, so you can see this insulin here, but it's no longer, the cell's no longer really accepting it. The cell sees it, the insulin binds with it, but just something weird's going on, and that's the best way I can describe it. So insulin comes in, it binds with it, it tells the cells, hey, you know what, go ahead, take in some glucose, but it doesn't. So again, type 1 diabetes, no insulin. Type 2 diabetes, insulin, but not responding correctly. So we're going to go ahead and pause there before jumping to the next video to cover lipids.